had been working at this company for 3 years, and over time, everything became mechanical. Tasks came and went, spreadsheets were filled, reports were written. The monotony was so deeply ingrained that any change felt unusual. That's why when my supervisor assigned me the task of updating the employee list, I didn't question it. It was just routine bureaucracy, requiring no further thought. The list contained familiar names, but one stood out, giving me an odd feeling. I read it several times, trying to understand why it felt unfamiliar. Andrew Kolsnick was listed in the analytics department, employed for over a year, receiving a salary. Yet, I couldn't recall ever seeing him. The more I thought about it, the stronger my unease grew. I started searching the company database for any mentions of him. The records showed consistent attendance, participation in projects, and signatures on documents. But there were no photographs, no residential details, no birth date, not even contact information. Just dry data that looked complete but felt hollow, as if someone had meticulously created the illusion of his existence. The unsettling feeling turned into anxiety. If Kolsnick had really been working here for a year, why couldn't I remember a single interaction with him? I checked the internal access system. According to the logs, he entered the office daily and left in the evening, just like everyone else. It seemed impossible. I searched for him in security footage, pulled up several meeting recordings where he was supposed to be present. The footage showed the conference room, employees sitting at the table, working, discussing. But there was no one who could be Kolsnick. When the camera focused on his supposed seat, it was either empty or nearby colleagues reacted to something unseen. They leaned forward as if listening, turned their heads toward empty space, even responded at times. These moments triggered a primal fear in me. People were interacting with someone who simply didn't exist on the recordings. The next morning, a new document appeared on my desk. This was strange because no one had access to my workspace. The paper looked like an ordinary report, but it was signed by Andrew Kolsnick. A cold sweat ran down my back. How did this document get here? Who had left it? Looking around, I saw everyone working, paying no attention to me. I picked up the paper, ran my fingers over it, confirming that it was real, tangible, not some trick of my mind. The anxiety didn't fade. I took out my phone and recorded my desk, planning to check later if the document had really been there or if I had imagined it. Slowly, I moved the camera across my desk, my chair, then my computer screen. When I reviewed the footage, my heart stopped. On the video, sitting in my chair was a figure, dark, indistinct, barely leaning forward as if examining my documents. I looked up sharply, but there was nothing in front of me. I checked my phone again. The video was now empty, just as before. Deleting the recording, I felt my hands tremble. What had seemed like a strange coincidence had turned into something much worse. I dug into the company's archives, looking through past employee records. Over the last year, several people had resigned without explanation. They worked in different departments, but they all had one thing in common. They had checked the employee list before submitting their resignation. I decided to review security footage from the last day of one of them. The video showed a man sitting at his desk, typing. Then, suddenly, he froze, lifted his head, and glanced around as if he had heard something behind him. His breathing quickened, and he slowly stood up, as if sensing something threatening just behind him. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, he was gone. I rewound the footage, trying to see where he had gone, but he simply disappeared, without a trace. That was the last straw. The next day, I submitted my resignation. Without waiting for a response, I gathered my things and left the office quickly. But the feeling of being watched never left me. As I walked past my colleagues' desks, I overheard them discussing the new hire who would be replacing me. Someone asked for the name, and when I heard the answer, I froze. My name had appeared on the list. I've always loved archaeology, though it was more of a passion than a profession. I grew up in a small town in the western part of the country, where ancient ruins and forgotten artifacts were almost a part of the landscape. Every time I walked through the woods or gazed at the ruins on the hills, it felt like there was an invisible trace of history in every stone, every fragment of old brick. It was my passion, searching for lost stories and uncovering the mysteries of the past. I began collecting old objects I'd stumble upon during walks through the woods or in abandoned villages. And though I wasn't a professional, more of an amateur, I always felt like there was something more to every find than just an object. One day, during a trip to the Carpathian Mountains, I set out in search of forgotten places that had been abandoned for centuries. It seemed like this part of the world held more secrets than anywhere else. I wandered among the tall trees and mountain paths when I noticed something unusual among the stones and plants. It was a small statue, half buried in the ground, carved from black stone. It resembled a human figure, but the face was distorted, unnatural, as though altered by time or the very material itself. The symbols etched on it were unfamiliar. They looked like an ancient script, but they were incomprehensible. I couldn't understand why this particular find struck me so deeply. I felt like it held some sort of significance, but I couldn't grasp what it was. I took the statue home with me, deciding to study it more closely. At home, I cleaned it off, examining every detail. I photographed it from all angles and began searching for any information on similar artifacts. The more I looked at it, the more I felt there was something important in it, something that didn't quite belong to my world. The first strange sensation came a few days later when I began to notice that something was off with my surroundings. At first, it was little things. I would find objects out of place, even though I was sure I had left them in their original spots. My watch, which I always kept on the bedside table, would suddenly be across the room. Books would disappear from the shelf, even though I was certain I had left them there. But those things were nothing compared to what happened next. I began to hear sounds that weren't there before. A faint rustling in the dark, as though someone was quietly moving around the room. I would often wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises, but when I would turn on the light, there was no one there. Once, I even thought it was just a nightmare or nerves, but what happened the next night made me take it more seriously. I woke up to find the room unnaturally cold. I opened my eyes and saw a small figure in the darkness. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but then I realized it was the statue. It stood on my nightstand, its shadow stretching unnaturally on the wall. The shadows seemed to grow longer and longer, its outlines growing larger. My heart began to race, and my breathing became heavy. I quickly turned on the light, but the statue remained in place, as though nothing had happened. The following days became more unsettling. I started hearing whispers that I couldn't explain. It was a quiet voice, like a distant murmur inside my head. I tried to ignore it, but it grew harder and harder. I began to see strange flashes in the corners of the room, like an illusion of something moving just out of my peripheral vision. Another thing, my dreams became far more vivid and intense. In my dreams, I wandered through ancient ruins among stone figures, similar to the statue. These figures would stare at me with lifeless eyes, as though they were watching every move I made. I could hear the whispers, but they were so indistinct and unintelligible that they only made everything more frightening. In every movement, in every glance, I felt their presence. A few days later, I realized I couldn't just get rid of the statue. I tried to throw it away several times, once even tossing it deep into the forest. But every time, when I came back home, I would find it in its place. It didn't disappear. It was like a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. Eventually, I sought out an old expert in artifacts, someone I had heard had experience with such objects. As soon as he saw the statue, his expression grew tense. "This isn't just an artifact," he said with concern. "It's part of an ancient cult that used statues like this to summon spirits or even absorb souls. They were created to immortalize their creators and merge them with the spirits of that time. If it has chosen you, you've become a part of it." His words sounded like a verdict, and I understood that there was no going back. I decided to research more, to try and find a way to stop this nightmare. But every time I approached the statue, I felt its power growing stronger. Eventually, I realized I might not be able to free myself. The statue had become a part of me, and I had become a part of it. Perhaps to rid myself of it, I would have to sacrifice something greater. What that was, I didn't know. But I also knew that I no longer had a choice. I've always had a fascination with old things. Online, you can find listings for old cameras, tape recorders, or even televisions. And every time I came across such an item, I couldn't resist the temptation. One day, I stumbled upon an ad for an old video camera. It was from a well-known brand, a typical model from the 90s. The kind of camera people used to record family holidays and trips before digital technology became widespread. The price was too good to pass up, so I decided to check it out. I contacted the owner, who told me he hadn't used it in years and just wanted to get rid of it. The camera looked pretty worn out, with scratches, but nothing that suggested any serious malfunction. His offer was too good, so I headed out to pick it up right away. When I brought the camera home, I noticed that it came with a memory card. It looked outdated with some wear and tear, and I initially thought it wouldn't work, just like the camera. But on a whim, I decided to insert it into my computer to see what might be on it. As soon as the card was inserted, I saw a few video files. They looked like ordinary home videos, celebrations, family trips, gatherings. Sometimes I even recognized familiar places in the footage, but I didn't think much of it. But among these usual videos, there was one I couldn't immediately make sense of. It caught my attention because it didn't look like a typical home recording. The camera was mounted on a steady tripod, and the entire shot focused on a dark corridor. The sound was faint and indistinct, but I could hear something softly whispering in the background. I noticed the camera moved very smoothly, as if someone were holding it, and stopped in front of a door. It seemed like the person filming was being very cautious, almost as if they were afraid of something or just trying to avoid being noticed. We then saw the door creak open involuntarily. Then nothing. The camera stayed still for a few seconds. Only the faint whispering, now slightly louder. I tried to decipher what the voice was saying, but couldn't make it out. It seemed like it came from a video itself, but I couldn't tell exactly what was being said. Then the camera jerked sideways, revealing a window. For a brief moment, a shadow vanished, leaving no trace. It was so strange that I immediately paused the video to check if it was a movie or a prank. But nothing was out of place. Everything seemed completely real. That video became something I couldn't shake off. I decided to watch more recordings from the memory card, hoping to understand what was going on. But each subsequent video only raised more questions. The same faint whisper was present in every file. Sometimes it sounded almost tangible, unnervingly real. It made you want to listen closely to every word, but nothing concrete ever came through. Just a sound that was terrifying. I watched several videos of people enjoying themselves at a party. They laughed, talked, but the same whispering sound remained in the background. Many didn't seem to notice, but with each replay, I started noticing more details. The feeling that there was someone else there made me uneasy. Then I found the last video. It was the scariest one. It was a video from the same apartment. The camera was now inside a room, and I could see hands holding it. That's when it struck me as odd. If this were a real video, I shouldn't have been able to see the hands. But they were there. And not just hands. They were holding the camera as if handing it off to someone else. Then, amidst all this, the whisper returned. And I clearly heard, "You found us." My heart stopped for a moment. I immediately tried to remove the card from the computer, but it refused to work. Every time I tried to open the video files, my computer gave an error, and the memory card no longer responded. The anxiety I felt became so overwhelming that I couldn't bring myself to leave the card in the computer any longer. I hid it in a drawer and couldn't bring myself to look at it again, even when I accidentally came across the camera. I don't know what happened with that memory card. Maybe it was a prank or part of some campaign. But since then, I can't shake the feeling that it was something more. Something real. And maybe, just maybe, someone is watching me now. Every time I try to forget about it, I hear the same whisper as though it came from the video. And I can't be sure anymore that it was all just a figment of my imagination.